All right, welcome back. So we are having another conversation. This is from my year-long Foundations project. This is the 5th month, and this month was focused on reading. So once again, I have my lovely wife, Zaritza,
Hi.
here, and we're going to have a little conversation about reading, why it matters, and also some of the stuff that maybe I kind of encountered about reading while I was doing the research for this month.
Yeah, I think I know, and everyone else that has followed you over the years knows that you're a big reader.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, why do you think that people are reading less books these days than they used to?
Yeah, so I found this interesting Gallup poll. This was actually found when I was doing research for my last book about sort of trends in how many books American reads. And Americans are reading less books now than they were I believe there was like the 1991 and 2003 surveys. People are reading less books. So this is not just, me anecdotally, although certainly I get a lot of that. I get a lot of people like, I can't sit through a book. I can't pay attention. That's definitely a complaint you hear a lot these days. What's interesting though is that if you look at the average number, so the number in this Gallup poll is average number of books read, and there's probably a little bit of inflation there. People, how many books did you read this year? And then people, bump up the numbers a little bit more. I'm sure if you got the actual data from people's Kindles or things like that, you'd actually know how many books they're reading versus they read 10 pages and they put the book down. But I think the number was quite high. It was definitely over a dozen books per year. And I remember when I shared this statistic with the raw average, there were all these people there's no way people are reading 12 books a year. I can't even read 3 books a year, this kind of thing. They were just flabbergasted about it. And I think the real difference is that reading is one of these things where there's a lot of skewness to the distribution. So yes, the kind of median person is maybe only reading a few books per year, but there are people who read a few hundred books a year and they skew the average quite a bit. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to recognize when we're dealing with the reading foundation is just how unequal the distribution is. And I think, for dealing with why people have been reading less, the obvious culprit is social media, right? People are on TikTok and Instagram. The leisure time that we have is increasingly devoted to these new forms of media. But the distribution is still there. There's still people who are reading a lot of books. I think they just are a minority. They're kind of a rare breed rather than, the typical person.
That's true. I find that interesting though, because we have access to all this information. We have access to the internet and social media. There is podcasts now that discuss different types of different books, and they do overviews of books. Why do you think that it's important for us to be reading instead of gaining that same knowledge from social media to follow up on that question, do you think there is a difference of reading a book and listening to it? Because then now there is Audible as well. And I think a lot of people choose to listen to books because it's easier. They can do it while they're driving or while they're doing their errands. Do you think there's a difference between reading and listening?
So I'll talk about the second one first, because I think that one there's actually a pretty good answer, which is that I think that ultimately what matters is the knowledge conveyed in books. Okay. So the little bit of research that I encountered on different modalities does find that print is still probably best. So a paper book is probably a little better for overall comprehension, retention. I think that's particularly true of, dense, difficult material. Audiobooks, I think if you were to compare conditions where people are sitting in a quiet, distractionless room and listening versus reading, I don't think you'd see a huge difference, at least for native speakers for whom, listening and reading comprehension abilities are probably similar. But obviously the thing about audiobooks is that you're usually doing it when you can't read. So you're doing something else. So my own personal belief is that probably impacts comprehension. I know for myself, certainly, if I'm reading a book that I know I need to use for research later, the audiobook, the ones that I listen to are worse. I have a harder time recalling specific details. I have a harder time getting the notes. And I suspect that that's true in general. Right. But, again, it's one of these issues of that's a thing to nitpick. Maybe if you're reading like lots and lots and lots of books that you're like, okay, I'm going to get this one in paper because I want to make sure I really understand it. Whereas for a lot of people, I mean, the alternative is not, well, I was going to only read one book this month, so I have to decide audio or paper. It's like I was, going to be spending this time listening to something else, like a podcast, or listening to, a YouTube video or something, and then you're comparing that. And so on the first question about why should we read books in particular, I think it's a mistake to kind of view these media as being homogenous. There are a lot of terrible books. There are a lot of really great social media accounts, really great podcasts. So it's impossible to, say, should you be reading X, and I could pick out some book that's just sort of like not worth the paper it's printed on from the bookstore. And there's a lot of online content that is fantastic, that's better than most books I read. So there's a lot of distribution. So this is not to generalize. But if I were to speak about the averages, the one advantage that books have, and I can say this as someone who creates content online and also has written books, is that typically to write a book, you know that at least a smart person has been thinking about this topic for a couple years, because that's how long it takes to write a book. Whereas if you are creating a YouTube video, or you're creating an article online, or even like, short form content on TikTok or Instagram, the amount of depth of work that you had to put into it is often a much lower threshold. And often the incentives are different. Like even to compete on these platforms, you're often incentivized to produce content hastily, quickly, the kind of like startup maxim of like, move fast and break things. Well, it's like publish quickly and see what sticks. And that's not necessarily conducive to expertise. Is not conducive to someone who, I know this person has read, 100 books on this topic before they wrote something about it. Maybe they only saw another tweet themselves before they wrote their own message. So I think it's still the case that like the highest quality books are probably higher quality than any other media, and the average quality book is better than most other media. But again, there's significant exceptions to that. And I think, you really do need to judge on a case by case basis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good answer. I struggle with balancing it as well, because obviously I want to read more, and finding time to sit down and read and focus on one book is hard. But I always have one or two books that are just kind of there, and then one book on Audible, and then a few podcasts that I like, and I just pick and choose based on my available time of what I'm gonna choose. But I'm really, really trying to stay away from social media, because I just find it too overstimulating lately, and then the time that I have to relax has become very important to me, that to the point where I'm choosing to buy a magazine to look at what's fashionable and new recipes ideas, because I don't want to get because that's the type of stuff I consume on social media. But just scrolling and looking at this has become just too much. I just can't do it. I need to take a pause of it, that I'm like, okay, well, but I still want to consume these different things. I know this doesn't have anything to do with reading, but I guess it is.
No, it does. The media choices you make matter, Right. And I don't want to be too Cal Newport here, but I've worked with him on a lot of projects together, and he's really influenced me. And I remember when Deepwork came out, he made this quit social media chapter in the book, and it seemed hyperbolic. It seemed kind of like, I was using Facebook. I was a college student. This was my way of connecting with my friends.
Right.
It just seemed kind of overly austere. Like, why would you want to live that way? But I think he predicted the trend that we're living in. And, to relate it to our previous month, we were talking about nutrition. Capitalism, I tend to be someone who is in favor of the market and technology and innovations. But there's a way in which the sort of environment that we're in is to sort of cater to our most basic impulses, and our most basic impulses in our sort of diet tends to be not very healthful for us. Like, it's overly processed, too much added sugar, stripping out the nutrients, things that we we shouldn't be eating that. We should be eating a little bit more like we did 50 years ago. And similarly, I think with our informational, like attention economy, everything is driven towards how can I make this sort of have more gut appeal, which I think not only biases it towards being more cognitively simple, so it has to be a slogan, it can't be something that's thoughtful, it can't be something that has any cognitive complexity to it, but also even just making it something that's polarizing or outrage inducing or this kind of thing. I think the truth of most matters is often kind of complicated, and both sides on an issue often have good points, but instead you get these kind of like snap, anger inducing kind of posts and this kind of stuff. And it's because this is sort of the entire engine of attention is kind of like, oh, well, when I write this in a less inflammatory way, less people click on it. And in the old days, that might be like a difference in like 1% in terms of your sales. But when you have these algorithms that amplify things, 1% is the difference between like 3 orders of magnitude in terms of how much traction you get. And so it's very difficult, I think, to compete on that level if you are having that situation where, this type of message or this type of content, like we were even talking about this even on our YouTube channel, which, probably you're watching this, you're going to look down at the views and there's like, just a modest number of
maybe,
views. Not a huge number of views. And this was something that was a real change. Like when I started using YouTube, and I've never been a big YouTuber, but when I started using it, your videos went out to your subscribers. So if you said, oh, I like Scott, I want his videos, you'll get his videos. It doesn't work that way anymore. Now, you're still being put head to head against people you haven't subscribed to. And so every content creator on YouTube is incentivized to create kind of provocative thumbnails. And in some ways this is good. It does lead to higher quality stuff. I can't just keep publishing garbage just because I have lots of subscribers. But it does mean that it changes the relationship between, oh, I trust Scott, so I'm going to read his messages, even if they're not like the most hyperbolic, versus every single piece of content has to stand alone. It either goes viral or no one sees it, even the people who like you. It's created a change in how content's consumed. And so it's one reason that I still favor like email newsletters, which are kind of old tech, because they allow that kind of relationship with an author rather than a relationship with, kind of what is most eye-catching and attention-grabbing. But it's definitely not the way the world's been heading. And books in that sense are very much, they're becoming this antiquated relic because they just don't compete in that way.
Yeah, but I still do notice lots of new books, lots of very popular books coming out, and people are talking about it. So the fact that people are talking about it, I think, is a good thing. And then going back to this month of you setting up this challenge of reading, you already read a lot. So how did you decide on the Keystone habit that you're setting for yourself for this month? Because for months you've already been reading like minimum of 10 books every month since you've started this project. And before, honestly, like I always see you reading something. You always have a book. So what was the Keystone habit that you set for yourself for your reading month? And then how did you achieve it?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I think like a kind of core concept in this whole Foundations project that I'm working on and the Foundations course that we're teaching that goes alongside it is this idea that most of these foundations follow this kind of diminishing returns curve, which means that in the beginning, when you're doing nothing of an activity, doing that first 10 minutes a week has this disproportionately high benefit because you're getting those really low-hanging fruit from that area of your life. But when you're doing an enormous amount of it, then it's maybe even flat, and in some foundations, maybe even negative. Now, I don't know what the shape of the curve is for reading books. I've never even seen an argument where someone makes it like, reading X number of books is like correlated with some kind of outcome. Although I expect it would be positive, if only just because more educated, smarter people tend to read more books. It may not even be a causative thing. But the idea here is that I read a lot of books, but I read a lot of books because I'm a writer and it's my job. Like for this Foundations program, every single month I'm reading about 10 books because I want to deliver a high quality course that has high quality expert advice. I don't want it to be like I read, 3 Instagram stories, then I base my content around that. That would be a dereliction of duty on my part. So I try my best there. I don't think that the average person necessarily needs to read that much. I mean, if you really like reading, if you have a lot of intellectual hobbies, you're very curious as a person, then yeah, maybe reading a dozen books a month is what you like to do. But I do think if the average person read 1 book a month, and if they were very serious about improving their knowledge on the topic, maybe a book a week, that would probably be a net improvement in people's general quality of life, even if they're not specializing as a writer or someone who produces things. And so for me, the thing I try to distill down was, aside from my projects, which are about learning something specific, what habit has served me best in reading more? And this is the idea of kind of always having a book with you, or always having the option to read a book whenever you're there. So I call it this always have a book, or AHAB. This is this habit, this idea that like wherever you are, there should be a book that you should be able to read. And this is now very easy to do because you can have Kindle app on your phone. So you have Kindle app on your phone, Audible on your phone. So you can have Kindle when you can stop and look at it. You can have Audible when you're on the go, and you can have paper books. Usually I have one by my bedside. I have a couple here at the office. I'll have one downstairs.
And like hundreds.
Well, these ones are mostly red, so I'm going to have to box some of these up. This is like a chronic problem for me, is that I keep buying bookshelves and then I run out of space. And so I now have, you can't see, but down here I've got this disorganized pile of books because there's no space to put it anymore. But this is a chronic problem for me of figuring out bookshelf space. But the basic idea is just, if you always have a book with you, it doesn't mean you're going to read the books, and it doesn't mean you have to read the books all the time. It's never like, oh, you must read with every spare moment of your day. That's too punitive. It's just that if you don't have a book to read, you're not going to read a book. That's like kind of like a logical problem. Like, when I think about the times where I didn't read a lot of books, or I read less books than I typically do, it's usually because I didn't have books I was excited to read kind of around me. And so this idea of just like creating the opportunity for a lot of reading is sort of the necessary but not always sufficient criteria for improving how much you read.
Yeah, that's great. I think we should name this video "Always Have a Book." I think that's a great title. Okay. In your essay, you had these quick takeaways, and I think they really kind of summarize what you've what you've discovered through this month, and I think instead of discussing some of the books individually that you read, I'll maybe read every takeaway, and you can kind of comment on it and come up and just tell me how you came to that takeaway. So number 1, it was reading relies on brain mechanisms that evolved to different jobs, recycled to be applied to the evolutionary recent tasks of reading.
Yeah, so this is Stanislaw Dane, and I'm maybe mispronouncing his name. He's a French neuroscientist, and he's done a lot of work on reading in the brain. And his research basically finds that across cultures, across languages, the very same, very precise area of the brain always is used for reading, which is kind of surprising in and of itself, because we know that reading only became widespread in the last few hundred years with universal education. It didn't even exist before 10,000 years. And so if you have any kind of sense of like evolutionary history, brains just haven't changed that much in that time. I mean, there's maybe some evolution that's happened in the last like 10,000 years, but it's very minimal compared to, the brain was basically the brain when we were, out living in the savannah and no one read anything. And so the idea that not only, are we able to acquire this skill that we don't, we didn't evolve to acquire, which is a sign of our intelligence, but also that it happens to always occupy the exact same space of brain, even in places which have very different languages. Like I thought it was very interesting that, Chinese and Japanese, which have obviously a very different writing system than we do, it occupies almost exactly the same place. It's like maybe a little bit biased towards the right hemisphere compared to the left hemisphere in some cases. But the fact that essentially the same system evolved supports this thesis that reading is something that's kind of we developed it to take advantage of tools we already had in the brain. So these are things for, processing sound, processing meaning, connecting concepts together, being able to distinguish visual shapes. He even makes this case that like the alphabet is something that's like evolved over time from its original shapes, which were kind of complicated pictures, to like increasingly simple little graphs, which are like closer to the basic units that we recognize in our brain. Like neurons are more tuned to things like the letter T and stuff. And so he makes this case that this was a sort of coevolution, which I don't know. I mean, this is something that's more scientific curiosity than like useful tip, but I think it's interesting to recognize that this is something that goes on, because I think reading is one of those things that if you learned it when you were a young age, you kind of take it for granted that you look at these black and white squiggles and you can understand things in your head. But it's kind of near miraculous that we're able to do that. So I'm very interested in sort of what goes on in making that happen.
Yeah, well, and we have 2 children as well, and watching them learn, one of them is 5, and so he's learning how to read now. Looking at him and trying and watching him trying to process that and figure it out is very interesting. And especially the 2-year-old is, because he's practicing letters, she's looking at him
pointing at the letters,
read and learn letters. So now she's also pointing at the letters, and I'm like, this is amazing. This is so crazy how they can just pick it up.
And
like
you come
that.
to appreciate how difficult it is. Like even just to give a little example. So today in his class they had to bring objects that started with the letter K. And if English, K doesn't start a lot of like household object names, and some of the ones it does start, like knife, for instance. He's like knife. It's N, knife.
Knife.
And I'm like, sorry, buddy. We really, the whole Anglosphere really screwed you over on this one. Because most other sensible languages were like, you know what, we're going to change the spelling so it makes sense. But English, the one that conquered the world, we're forced to learn this. One of the hardest spelling systems. I mean, I think you could argue that the Chinese and Japanese have it worse than us, but most languages that have alphabets have a much easier time. So
in Macedonian we have Cyrillic alphabet, and that's so much easier. And I started reading like very difficult books very early on, because you're reading it exactly the way it's spelled, so you can really get into it.
Explaining
early.
the concept of spelling bees to people in other countries. This has been one of my joys of like going to like Spain or something, and you explaining what a spelling bee is, and they just like don't understand. Like, wait a minute, what do you mean that like you have a competition to see how well you can spell things? So you just do it right out? No, that's English for you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next takeaway. You read about reading speed, and you've read about speed reading quite a bit in your writing career. But in this particular article, you said reading speed is mechanically and physiologically limited. Speed reading doesn't work. And the upper limit on reading without skimming or skipping stuff is probably around 500 words per minute for most people.
Yeah. So I have an interesting history here, because one of the most popular articles I wrote like back when I was like 17 or something like that, when I was first starting this blog, was this post called Double Your Reading Rate. And it was based on me taking a speed reading course and finding that, I could read faster because of it. And I actually measured it. It wasn't just like a hyperbolic title and this kind of thing. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to share this with other people. And it turned out to be quite popular. And it was interesting because at the time, the techniques that they get you to use is this, like you're trying to use a pointer, which means you're just basically like underlining words. And the theory behind it, which is not true, but the theory behind it is that it will control your eye fixation. So the idea is that your eyes don't actually move continuously over the page while you're reading. Rather, they have these saccades, so they kind of flick back and forth, and they happen very quickly. You don't notice you're doing this, but if you watch someone else's eyes, you can see they're doing it. So I recommend doing that, by the way. Watch someone else when they're reading a book. It's really weird what they're doing with their eyes. And so the idea was that if you have this pointer, you would have quicker fixations, you would be more efficient reading, and then also you would eliminate subvocalization, which is that little voice in your head which says what you're reading. The idea is that voice puts a speed limit on how fast you can read because there's only so fast that voice can go. And so if you got rid of it, you'd be able to read much faster. Now, it was something that I thought was very interesting at the time, and I thought it worked for me, so I shared it. And then a number of years later, I kind of stopped using the speed reading techniques. Like I stopped using the pointer, I stopped worrying about subvocalization. And so I kind of got into this state of like mild skepticism at my own previous advice. And I decided, you know what, I've been hearing kind of offhand that some people have been very dismissive of the speed reading stuff, so I'm going to like do the research. So I went and I did a real deep dive into the research on speed reading and found out that basically when people have studied it, it doesn't work. And I think the reason I'd fooled myself before was that it's not that you can't read faster. It's not that you can't go faster in some kind of fundamental speedway. The issue is that when you're reading, you're going to have worse comprehension because you're skipping stuff. And so I was reading quite easy books, and my comprehension measures were fairly easy. And so I was essentially skimming them and still understanding quite a bit from skimming them. And so sort of patting myself on the back for like, oh, I'm doing so great. I'm skimming them. And as I've sort of understood more and more about it, like there's been people who have devoted their entire lives to studying the physiological mechanisms associated with reading, and they essentially find this out, that when you read, there is these physiological limitations, like how quickly the eye can move and focus and how much text you can focus. So it's actually quite small. You're essentially only seeing this like almost like, a quarter-sized area of the page. That's the only part that you can resolve. And so your eyes are moving across it. And when people read, fluent readers, they do focus on every word. If you skip, you can skip maybe some really small words like and the sometimes. But if you're generally skipping words when you're doing this reading process, you're not going to understand everything perfectly. And so these sort of well-documented findings have established this kind of speed limit for things. And so I think this isn't to say that you can't read faster, but that the reading faster process is largely dependent on having read a lot, having a lot of background knowledge, and not on these kinds of techniques. And another one that I never personally use but gets boasted about a lot is this rapid serial visual presentation, or this idea, you have to have a special technology for this, but basically you have a word that appears at the same part of the screen over and over and over again. So it just flicks back, that sort of word. And that way your eyes don't have to move around. And the studies I've had read on this have also been somewhat disappointing, although there's some sort of limited cases where you can maybe read a bit faster. Most of it seems to be that if you actually try to read this way, it's harder. Most people can't do it even with training. And so my feeling is that there's a benefit to skimming. There's a benefit to understanding how to skip over stuff in what you're reading and still understand what you want. So that's a very useful skill to learn. But the overall idea that, you can just improve your reading speed to, some of the claims are ridiculous, like you're flipping through the book like this and you're reading it.
Yeah.
Just they're not true. And so I think that's an important thing, because I think when people see someone who reads like 100, 200 books a year, they think they must be doing something like that. And the fact that they're not, I think, is important. Yeah.
Yeah. So following up on that, your other quick takeaway was knowledge is the biggest driver of comprehension and memory. The more you know, the more you'll remember from what you read. So if you read more, you know more, which makes further reading easier and more enjoyable. And then you said reading well comes from reading lots.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is like kind of the boring answer. I mean, people would love it if there was some technique that if you just spent a month practicing it, you'd be this like excellent reader and you'd just be able to read books. But I think the best example, this is the person that I always hold up as like, this is who I'd like to be as a reader, is the blogger Tyler Cowen. Because Tyler Cowen, you see his reading list and he's reading, maybe not 100% of each book. I don't know exactly, like he's reading it cover to cover every single word. But he gives these reading lists where it's just, what I've been reading, and then it's a dozen extremely dense kind of like books about history or this kind of stuff. Some like 1,000-page book about some obscure historical event is showing up in his reading list. And, he riffs on it and he's sort of like, well, I like this book, but, I knew all this already and this kind of thing. And I think it's easy to be like, oh, well, this person, they must have some trick or something that they're doing. But I think that the real truth is that Tyler Cowen is able to read so much because he's read so much. And when you've read a lot of books and you pick up a book, it's kind of like you're watching a movie where you already know, like you've already read the book and you're watching the movie now. You already kind of know what's happening. And so whenever someone mentions something, every single fact that sticks out, you can compare it to like 8 other things that you already know. And so this enables you to read and understand what you read and to read more quickly, because even if you do skip over a little bit, you can often fill in the blanks because you understand so much already. And so I think this is kind of disappointing because it's a very long-term goal, but I do think it shows that if you were to regularly invest in reading lots of books for 10 years, 20 years, you would be the kind of person who could read really fast. And I think the issue is just most people don't make that regular investment. This is not just my speculation either. There's been a long history of like cognitive science work showing that the amount you retain from reading a text passage is most directly related to what you already know on that topic, and not, for instance, to just your intelligence or your reading comprehension. So one of these famous studies was involving students, and they were reading a description of a baseball game. And then they had a comprehension test of like, what do you remember that was indicated in the text? So we're not just talking about like, you had to have knowledge about, things that were outside just to know what the text was about. But like literally, what do you remember from the text? And the strongest predictor of that was how much you knew about baseball. Whereas being a good reader or a poor reader didn't matter so much. It made a little bit of a difference, but it didn't matter so much. And so I think, again, when we think about people who are good readers or people who are even we think of as smart or intellectual, I mean, it's parasitic on having read a lot of stuff. So when, you think someone's so smart, we tend to equate that to some sort of inborn talent. And probably that's a little bit of a factor, but it's probably overwhelmingly that, well, yeah, but that person's read a lot more on this topic. So when they have to read more about it, they can immediately integrate that into what they already know. And so that's the thing to invest in if you're wanting to be a better reader.
Just read.
Yeah, just read a lot.
And read about things that interest you, and then find other things.
And things that don't interest you, that will interest you. Yeah, that's
exactly. And but that's the thing. More you read about something, more interesting becomes, because then you start to discover different things about it. I know this is kind of random and personal, but I'm never gonna forget when we went to Costa Rica, you and me, and we met those judges. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And they were judges.
European
right?
Union, I think they were like patent judges in the EU. Very sophisticated.
And they were
guys,
knowledgeable.
Yeah.
And I remember we were staying in this tree house on this person's property in Costa Rica. It was like, I think it was the first international trip you and me took together, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think so,
Yeah. It was early in like our dating. And I remember sitting with them, and they started telling me about the history of Macedonia. And they were just like, they just knew so much, and they were just I found them so interesting to talk to. They were old. I mean, they weren't that old, but they were older than us and very well read. And I loved sitting with them and talking to them about all these different things. But I think that's story,
but I think that's true though. I feel like, you can tell when you meet people how many books they read, because it's like, I like a lot of what having really smart opinions is just that, I read this somewhere else and it persuaded me, like I think we overestimate how much just sort of raw intellectual horsepower matters, and we underestimate how much just simply knowing a lot of things matters for our success. And this is like a conversation because I've written these 2 books on learning, right here, by the way. I've written these 2 books on learning, and so I go on podcasts, and like the real talking point, like the thing that like these interviewers like want me to say, and then I have to like be like, no. is they want me to say, well, isn't the problem with school that we just like teach kids all these like facts and just stuff that like, who cares about that,
You're never gonna need algebra again.
Or even just like, it's all that stuff that I don't need to know. And I mean, I think you could I don't want to get too much into the philosophy of education because obviously there's limited time. You have to make choices about what to teach. There's obviously trade-offs. But I think the mental model people have of learning is wrong, that they have this mental model that, well, what really matters is sort of acquiring some kind of skill, like this is some technique that you must master. And then that definitely applies to some things, right. But the brain is built out of knowledge. That is how it works. And so people are smart because they know lots of stuff, you know, and that's even true in knowing stuff in the sense of like, you're a really good mathematician when you know lots of math. And I think that's something that we have a hard time accepting, that we think that it's sort of like, well, intelligence is this like, oh, you know, you're a brain in a vacuum and then like from first principles, you like deduce the whole universe. That's not how it works. It's that you know tons and tons and tons and tons of stuff so that whenever you're solving some problem, you've already seen like 80% of it before. So you just have to use your intelligence in that last 20%. Yeah. And I think people, especially if you had a less intellectual background or you didn't have intellectual role models, there can be this kind of, I don't know, maybe this like status anxiety or this sort of like nervousness when you meet people. But I think it's something that like you can fix that. You can go to the library and learn lots of stuff, and then you will also be a smart person. So there's something very democratic, I think, about reading lots of books, because no, I don't want to make the case that everyone's perfectly equal and they're going to have equal intelligence. But I think we just so often are looking at someone's cognitive abilities and assuming it's something like a mental horsepower rather than a storehouse of knowledge. And if you have the latter model, I mean, then that's the way to improve yourself, right? Is read a lot of books and you'll be a smarter person.
For sure. Yeah. I think people love to kind of label things and be like, oh yeah, they're smart, but there's just so much more to it. And I think people also really like shortcuts too. And believe that, oh, just something is just so easy. You just had to do these steps and there you are, right?
Well, it's disappointing if you think about like, oh, well, I want to have this ability, like I want to have this, and then you think about like, well, you just have to read like 1,000 books. It just seems so daunting. It's like, where would I even start? But I think if you can tap into that basic curiosity you had about things, that like you're an interested person, you want to know about things, and you can make that investment in those habits and realize that, you know, the kind of nutrients you need are probably in books that you're going to have to sit down and work through, rather than in, you know, this took 8 seconds and I understood it immediately when it was said. You know, I think that's an investment that takes time. So I you know, I don't want to be overly moralizing here about this. I think everyone has to decide for themselves what they want to read, what they want to learn about, what they want to invest in. But I think I want to reflect that possibility, because I think sometimes we've kind of been conditioned to this idea that, you know, that kind of self-cultivation is not possible, or that, you know, oh, well, I'll never be able to do this because I just don't have the right stuff. But I think the right stuff you need is mostly being interested, is mostly just being like, oh, I actually like, you know, I enjoy reading this and I enjoy learning about this. That if you have that, you can make up for anything. Like, I think about that in terms of language learning. There's probably people who have a gift for learning languages. They'll just pick it up like this and they'll be faster than you. Sorry. But the person who's genuinely interested in learning that language, they are going to win in the long run. It's tortoise in the hare. The tortoise wins every time. If you're someone who's not that interested in learning other languages, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you have the gift. And so similarly with all knowledge, if you're interested in things, you will be smart about it. And it's just about being patient about getting there.
Right. That just gave me chills right there. That's so well said.
That's my speech to read more books
to
everyone who's made it to the end of this YouTube video.
Everyone that makes it. Yeah. I read this comment from one of the people, and thank you. That was a really sweet comment. But they said that it's really nice of how it's very obvious that I admire you so much, because
I'm a lucky man. What can I say? Yeah.
Well, no, it's very, very beautifully said. And, you know, every time we talk, and this is why we kind of wanted to do these videos, because we talk like this to each other all the time, and it's in
fewer microphones, but yeah.
It's even more natural.
Yeah.
But you always have these very good points about all these different things, and I think people need to hear it, and they need to really think about it, because I think it's a really good viewpoint to have, and I hope that this helps people and motivates them to read more.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So that being said, what are you reading at the moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, this month was an interesting month because, well, first of all, I had done a lot of the reading about reading when I wrote my last book. So I kind of felt like I just read a lot of these books. Like I read big books about the science of reading. So I didn't do as many books on this topic. I think I only read 5 books for this month on reading itself. And so I was like, okay, this is like my breather month because I feel pretty good about my habits and I've already done the research. So I wanted to read a little bit more fiction. And so 2 books in particular, I didn't get them totally finished in this month because they're crazy long. But one book that I had wanted to read for a long time was the Chinese classic Journey to the West, or COG. And that book was something that I had in Chinese sitting on my shelf for like a decade. And I had like read maybe 2 pages. It was just like way too hard for me in Chinese. This is like an older kind of Chinese, and it like starts off talking about, you know, the kind of like Chinese cosmology. So it's like doubly difficult in the beginning and stuff. And so I finally was like, you know what, I'm going to read it in English first. And then if I like it in English, maybe I'll read it again in Chinese, and then I'll have a little bit of a comprehension guide for it. And it's a great book, but I realized sort of when I started reading it, it is a crazy long book. So I'm reading the, I want to say it's the Anthony Yu, maybe I'm getting his name wrong, translation. And I think the book is like, the unabridged book is like over 2,000 pages. So I did not finish that. I even got like, he's just starting the journey and where I'm at right now, which is like about page, I don't know, 400 or something. And so I was reading that book. And then the other one was on Audible. I started listening, this was in the summer, I started listening to The Count of Monte Cristo in French again. So this is a book.
Which is your favorite book?
This is my favorite novel. Yeah. I read the English translation in college, and then when I was in France, I read it in French, and then I've kind of like made stabbing attempts to read it again in French a few times. Even when we went to Paris, I got this like beautifully bound version of it that also has the Three Musketeers after in French, and it's a beautiful book, but it's like holding like this phone book when you're reading.
It took like half your luggage.
Yeah, I really wanted it, so I had it, but I think, you know, I only got up to the, like, you know, him getting escaped from the prison or something, just because it was a big book. It was kind of unwieldy. And so I decided to listen to it because I thought it would be good for listening. But the unabridged audiobook of Le Comte de Monte Cristo is 50 hours long. So it took me at the end. And so like just towards the end of the month, I had just like a little bit left of listening to it. And I don't expect that I'm going to spend a lot of time on this kind of literature right now, just because next month we're going to be talking about outreach. And I know I'm going to want to read a lot of books fresh. I want to get back to that 10 books. So I know this is like a long-term goal. I'd like to read more fiction and more classic literature and things like that. But some of it's probably going to wait for this project to be done when I'm, you know, it's hard to read 10 books and then also read like, you know, Moby Dick at the same time.
maybe in the summer.
Maybe in the summer, yeah.
Moby Dick. That's great. And let's go to the closing comments, and also maybe a short update on all the previous months, which now there's a 4, few of them.
I'm going to have to give the real bullet point version soon, because we're doing like 10 of these things. Yeah. So they've been good. So the fitness has been continuing to go well. I've been keeping up with the running and stuff. I know we had a little bit of an issue because you had broken your foot briefly, and then that kind of, I had been on this like waking up at 5:45 to go exercise every single morning.
That was okay. Me breaking my foot, though, it was not the only reason. It was also we went into fall and winter, and it's dark in the morning. I know you were saying.
I think it was the trigger, though, because it was a little bit right at the beginning. You weren't able to carry our daughter down the stairs, and so I stopped going right in the morning. And then when I stopped going right in the morning, and it's totally dark until like 8 o'clock. It was like, I don't want to run in the pitch black anymore and this kind of thing. And so it was the precipitating event. But then I kind of decided, okay, I'm going to shift my habit elsewhere, which is funny because my whole like fitness rationale was that, okay, well, the problem before was the wrong time slot. Like I was trying to go to the gym at the office, and I do think I fixed that problem. But I think it's funny that like the habit, you know, in terms of cue response kind of frameworks, totally different now, even though I'm still doing it. And so I think, I don't know, this is a longer thought, but maybe there's some thinking about like, how do we actually make behavior change? Because I think this idea that it's just about making it an automatic reflex, that's an important component, but it's not the full story. That a lot of improving a foundation is about changing your personal standards, changing your attitude towards it, your self-efficacy, this sort of problem-solving thing. So I'm sure I'll write more about it on the blog. It's probably not the place to get into too much detail about it right now, but I think it's just interesting to me that like the thing that was working really, really well for the first few months, I'm doing something totally different now, and it's still working, but it's totally different. So so that's been good, and productivity's still been good. Been kind of maintaining the full capture system. It's, you know, obviously there's more tasks than there is time in the day to do them all, but it has helped for making sure those sort of like easily forgotten reminders for things are stored and recorded somewhere, and also for coordinating in our family. I think it's gotten a lot better. For money, for personal finance, still going well. Like some of the things that I had set up in that month, like applying for life insurance, those things came through, and some of the other changes that we made in terms of like how we're tracking it, continuing with that. And then food was something that I was doing quite intensively during that month of tracking, and I'm no longer tracking now, but I'm continuing to like maintain the weight that I lost in that period of time, as well as maintaining the kind of overall nutritional quality. I think food is a particularly challenging one because it really isn't one habit, and it's one of these things where like you're trying to do everything kind of in the right quantity. So it's our brains are easier to do things black or white. So I think, if, just as an example, if you're trying to quit smoking or drinking, it's easy to just be like, okay, I don't drink or smoke. Now, I'm not saying that it's ideal for everyone, but it's at least simple, right? Whereas eating, everyone needs to eat, and every food is on some kind of like sliding scale of both healthfulness, and you need to have some variety and this kind of thing. And so it's no wonder that people have a hard time sticking to things, and often the diets that they do stick to and that work are kind of like unhealthily restrictive, like they're just like extreme versions of something, because people find it easier to be like, I'm vegan or keto or whatever it is. They're easier to like put that label on it because it has very straightforward rules, or intermittent fasting or what have you. Right. And so kind of maintaining a healthy diet with this kind of ambiguity about what is healthy does have some challenges, but I'm still working on it. And I think by the end of the year, I'll have a better sense of like how well that stuck through, and also what changes have been permanent, which ones were temporary, just as with the fitness one. So, I mean, it's we've kind of finished the first like almost half of the project. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the next 7 months go, and how we're going to continue to stack and integrate some of these things, as well as the people that I'm working on in the course, because in the course, they're also making some of these changes, and, seeing how it impacts, not just weirdos like me, but regular people who are also trying to do these things as well.
That's great. Yeah, I've been really liking how we've been collaborating about everything as well, and talking through every month, and how we can implement different things for our family, and for our family overall, not just for ourselves personally. It's been really great, and I'm also very thankful about this project. I've been enjoying doing it alongside you, even though I've had more setbacks with breaking my foot, but now I'm healed, everything is good. I'm also back to exercising. The exercising has been really good, because we've also sort of built a little gym in our house, trying to stay active and trying to also do things that are making it as convenient as possible, even though going to a gym or going outside for a run is good. We live in Vancouver. It's very rainy in the winter time, so we can't always be outside. So we've bought a spin bike at home. We have weights. It's like the reading, always have weights.
Yeah, always have weights. Well, it is something that like I long resisted, the kind of home gym move, because I prefer working out of the home. But I think there is this kind of, I think now that I'm at a point where I've been exercising so consistently, to me, it's sort of like the mental barrier to exercising is lower. So having a home workout is actually a good option. Whereas before it would have just been, well, I don't like doing this, and I also don't want to exercise. So the effort barrier, I'm not going to do it, right? I'm just not going to exercise today. Whereas now it's like, well, I got to exercise today, but maybe you're out and the kids are sleeping. I can't leave the house, so I've got to work out at home. So making that investment has been nice as well.
It's been really nice.
So yeah, I'm sure we'll continue to talk about more. And I'm sure, if you've listened this far, maybe you'll listen to one of the other ones or one of the previous ones we've had, and we'll keep you updated on this project. And if you're interested in more, you can also check out my website where I have detailed lists of all the books I read for each month and recommendations for habits for each of these foundations that we're working on.
Also, if there is any particular questions you want me to ask Scott, feel free to comment below, and we'll see you next month.